The title is The Silent Frequency, and it's happening in New York City. The air in the city was thick with the scent of rain as Detective Nolan stood by the large bay windows of his modest apartment. The rhythmic patter of droplets on the glass provided a stark contrast to the chaos that had erupted a few hours earlier. His partner, Detective Parker, sat at the wooden desk, poring over the case files, his brow furrowed in concentration. A knock echoed through the quiet room. "It's open," Nolan called out, still lost in thought as he gazed at the skyline. A young officer stepped in, rainwater dripping from his cap. "Sir, the radio station called again. They want to know when you'll arrive." Nolan turned slowly, his sharp blue eyes narrowing. "Tell them we'll be there in 10 minutes. And make sure they don't touch anything." The officer nodded and hurried out. Parker closed the file, his lips pressed into a thin line. "It's strange, Nolan," he murmured. "A girl found murdered in a locked radio station booth, and nobody heard a thing." Nolan grabbed his coat from the rack and motioned for Parker to follow. "Let's find out just how silent that booth really was." The radio station, WQTX, was housed in an old Art Deco building that had seen better days. Faded neon signs flickered outside, casting an eerie glow on the pavement. As the detectives entered the lobby, they were greeted by the station manager, a tall, wiry man named Grant. "Thank you for coming, detectives," Grant said nervously, wringing his hands. I still can't believe it. Melody was one of our best hosts. Melody Stevens, a well-known radio personality, had been found dead in the recording booth during her evening show. The station had gone off air mid-broadcast, and when the producers rushed in, they found her lifeless body slumped over the control board. No signs of a struggle. No forced entry. Parker glanced at Nolan. "Do we know the cause of death?" Grant swallowed hard. "The paramedics said it looked like asphyxiation, but we don't understand how. The booth is soundproof, and the door was locked from the inside." "Any enemies?" Nolan asked, his voice devoid of emotion, eyes scanning the room. Grant hesitated. Melody was popular, but she had her share of critics. You know how these things go. Some people loved her, others, not so much. She had recently been getting strange calls during her show. "Strange how?" Parker inquired, pulling out his notebook. "Just weird. The caller never spoke. She'd pick up, and there'd be silence. She laughed it off at first, but it started happening more frequently. She seemed rattled the last few nights." Nolan raised an eyebrow. "And you didn't think to report this?" "I didn't think it was that serious," Grant protested. "A lot of radio personalities get crank callers. It comes with the job." Nolan wasn't convinced, but decided to press on. "Show us the booth." The recording booth was on the second floor, at the end of a narrow hallway. The thick, soundproof walls seemed to swallow the detectives as they stepped inside. It was a claustrophobic space, dominated by a large control board and a microphone that hung eerily in the air like a suspended noose. Nolan's eyes immediately went to the chair where Melody had been found. A single red rose lay on the floor next to it. "That wasn't here before," Grant said, his voice trembling. "I swear, when the paramedics took her away, there was no rose." Nolan crouched down, carefully picking up the flower with a gloved hand. "Parker, bag this." Parker nodded and took the rose, slipping it into an evidence bag. "This feels personal," he said quietly. Nolan stood up, his gaze sweeping the room. "Check the recordings from her last show. I want to hear everything from the moment she went on air to the second she went off." Back at their office, the two detectives sat in front of a computer, listening to the playback of Melody's final broadcast. Her voice was smooth, confident, as she chatted with her listeners about the usual topics: current events, music, and a sprinkle of lighthearted gossip. But something shifted about 20 minutes in. Her tone became more strained, as if she were suddenly aware of something or someone in the booth with her. And then, at the 23-minute mark, came the dead air. No static, no sound. Just nothing. "That's when she died," Parker murmured. Nolan didn't respond. He rewound the recording and played it again, this time amplifying the volume. Still nothing. But then, on the third listen, something faint caught his attention. A low, almost imperceptible hum. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Do you hear that?" he asked. Parker frowned and adjusted the sound levels. "It's faint, but yeah, I hear it now. It's like feedback." "From the equipment?" Nolan shook his head. "No, it's too rhythmic. Almost like breathing." The two detectives sat in silence for a moment, the realization dawning on them both at the same time. Someone had been in that booth with Melody, hiding just outside of her line of sight, controlling their breath, waiting for the perfect moment. "Check the station's blueprints," Nolan ordered. "There has to be another way in." It didn't take long for Parker to find it. Hidden behind a false panel in the booth was a small ventilation duct, just big enough for a slender person to crawl through. It led to a maintenance room in the basement, far from prying eyes and security cameras. As they descended into the depths of the building, Nolan's mind raced. The rows, the silent calls, the hidden passage. This wasn't just a random killing. It was planned, methodical. They reached the basement, the air damp and cold. The maintenance room was cluttered with old equipment, dusty shelves, and, in the corner, a small cot. On the wall above it hung several photographs of Melody, all taken without her knowledge at the grocery store, leaving the station, sitting in a cafe. Parker's stomach turned. Whoever this is, they've been stalking her for months. Nolan scanned the room, his sharp eyes picking up something glinting on one of the shelves. He walked over and picked up a small silver key. "The key to the booth," he murmured. Back at the station, they confronted Grant. "We found the stalker's hideout," Nolan said coldly. "In your basement." Grant's face went pale. I had no idea." "Save it," Parker snapped. "This wasn't a random killing. The person who did this knew Melody's routine. They knew the station's layout. They had access to everything." Nolan stepped forward, his voice low. "The only question is, how involved were you?" Grant backed away, his hands shaking. "You think No. I loved Melody. She was like a daughter to me." Nolan's eyes bore into him. "Then why didn't you tell us about the key?" Grant's face crumbled. I didn't know it was missing." "Or maybe you didn't care," Parker said, stepping closer. "Maybe you knew exactly who had it." Grant's shoulders slumped. "It was her ex, David. He used to work here, but we fired him months ago. He didn't take it well. I never thought he'd... Oh God, this is my fault." Nolan and Parker exchanged a glance. They had their suspect. David was found hiding in an old warehouse near the edge of town, curled up in a corner, muttering to himself. When they arrested him, he offered no resistance, merely repeating the same phrase over and over. "She didn't hear me. She never heard me." As the detectives drove back to the station, Parker sighed, leaning back in his seat. "I'll never understand people like him." Nolan glanced out the window, his expression unreadable. "Some people can't stand being ignored. They'll do anything to be heard. And in the case of Melody Stevens, her killer had made sure her silence was permanent. The case closed, the detectives returned to their office, the weight of the night hanging over them. But for Nolan and Parker, there was always another case on the horizon, another mystery waiting to be solved.
Please subscribe and follow. See you in next video.